Thank you. Of course, I will be able to answer this in half an hour. I need some technical help, however, with some PowerPoints to concentrate your mind. Alessandra, perhaps, do you have this PowerPoint device? Thank you. Thank you. Starting on the note where John left off, clearly there is a major populist problem both in international media, the structure of the media, and how the internet selects certain types of news according to what you look at. So these algorithmic systems allows one to live in a world of alternative or preferred types of news. What I will try to analyze is this enormous question, and of course it will be a very sort of, I wouldn't say superficial or populist analysis, but it will not be very comprehensive. I think the title was agreed between Pier Paolo and myself somehow, and when I looked at it, I was wondering how to deal with this topic. Now, what I try to do is to, thank you, is first to define political participation and the requirements, and then the requirements of political participation. Participation is, of course, not voting, although it is very often expressed as voting percentages, voting turnout, and elections. So there's a focus on elections, but elections alone do not really matter. They are necessary, but they need much more. Some dictators in this world are re-elected and elected by 90+% turnout, majority even. I heard about one who was elected by 110% majority. And I always wonder why dictators need to be elected by 90%. Why not? It's sufficient 51%. In liberal democracies, we have, on the average in Europe, 65 to 85 in national elections, somewhat less in regional elections, which is a good turnout. In the US, it is usually much less. 50, something like that. Participation as such has to have, and I think Margaret alluded to that this morning, there has to be an impact, there has to be a result of it. Just participation for participation's sake may be satisfactory there and then, but it's not something that has an impact. It has no relation to power and to structures. I remember in the 80s in the institute where I worked at the time, we had a very autocratic director, and he had these meetings that were called allmöte, all meetings. Everybody working there, from sort of the clerk to the director, would sit down for hours discussing, and everybody felt good about participation. They all participated, and they had basically little or no impact on decisions. So structure matters. And political participation should be based on political ideas. The political is something specific as opposed to everything else. So the delimitation of the political is very important. And democratic participation is, of course, the bottom-up participation that we really talk about. There are many types of participation that matter little in autocracies. Revolutions are perhaps the participation type par excellence, but is an overturning of institutions, and I don't debate that in the paper. Economic equality is clearly, in some form, is clearly a necessary basis for democratic participation, a certain type of equality. And this has been debated, I think, in several papers and shown by Stiglitz et al. Or Stiglitz and other papers, that we have a negative development in terms of economic equality in society, also in Europe. Now let me look at criteria for political participation. And then bear in mind that we are talking about democratic political participation. The social teaching, the Western tradition, the familiar term we know, called the common good, is the summum bonum in Latin. This is a defining characteristic of what politics is about in ancient thought as the goal of political participation. And beyond this, there is two institutional requirements. There has to be some kind of check and balance, because participation is about power and the control of power, in addition to being about creating the good society. So these aspects, very often politics is reduced to the power in terms of interest pursuit, to the sort of balancing and compromise about interests, but the desirable type of political participation is beyond that. It is something different. But the power aspect is always there, and nonetheless, and it has to be controlled somehow by a balancing, because democracy is bottom-up participation. All political power derives from the people, must be controlled by the people in institutional arrangements. And rule of law then is what precedes participation historically, and I will say something more about this, but there must be a separation of powers, a check and balance somehow, which is always an incomplete or in a way imperfect system, but it is for want of a different mechanism, so to speak. Then subsidiarity is the other institutional requirement. It delimits what is political from everything else. Ideally, it's a principle of the limits of politics. Subsidium is to subsidize, it is to support what cannot support itself. And this is, of course, the Christian democratic ideological legacy. The subsidiarity principle is important because one can participate or should participate in decisions affecting oneself. That is the closeness, proximity idea. And there is also the idea that there are natural levels of government. So these three aspects, the common good and the two institutional criteria, guide the analysis. So participation is something that does not exist in a vacuum. It's not just activity. Why the focus on Europe? Well, this is perhaps because Europe is the most advanced democracies in a big cluster, if we look at the globe. It's also because Europe faces major fundamental political problems. And I think also methodologically one could argue that focusing on Europe with its stable institutional, or hitherto stable institutional future structure, allows us to study the changes, challenges, obstacles to good politics, in a way, good political participation today. As such, we do not have to control for variables that are beyond the changes. And I looked at some, in order to underline how the European countries, or European countries plus the US and Canada, they are, in a way, mature democracies institutionally. There is a database and analysis by lawyers called the World Justice Project, which is useful in this respect. It's based on interview data, representative as such, and elite interviews in all the world's countries. And one looks at various aspects of what they call rule of law, but really is about the state of democracy, such as check and balance system, non-corruption or corruption, transparency of political process, civic participation in the political process, NGOs and citizens, fundamental human rights implementation, order and security, and legal implementation, civil justice, criminal justice, etc. So along these 9 variables that are broken down into several others, one ranks the world's nations, and along all these 9 dimensions, the Nordics, the Dutch, the Brits, the Germans, and also the US, they figure basically on top. And on bottom, we find Venezuela, unfortunately, having descended into chaos. Venezuela, Afghanistan, Caucasian African states, and so on, at the very bottom. So there is clearly a tremendous difference in the world regarding every institutional aspect of participatory democracy. In Europe, the challenges we face right now in Europe, I think they are many-faceted, but they have a certain inner logic. There seems to be, on the one hand, populist parties are gaining in importance because they address these issues in a very simplistic manner, so there's an appeal in a way. There is a reaction against supranationality, EU, open markets, open borders. There's a revolt in a way, or reaction against migration, which is the key issue of the populist parties across Europe, and globalization, which has to do with both migration, open borders, but also economic inequality. So one is back to what one could say the primary issues of national politics, or politics as such. If we recall Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, why is there a need for a state? This is, of course, a contractual way of thinking. Well, citizens fund the police and fund some military force for protection. This is what we call the night watchman state. Because we need the collective good of protection, we are willing to pay taxes. So this is the safety, security, I think security of citizens, terrorism, migration, uncontrolled, illegal migration, as in 2015, severely upset the continent. Citizens, terrorism is something that happens very frequently. This is the security of the citizen in the state, the security of the state, Russian revisionism, its willingness to use military force, and its hybrid way of acting, also influencing elections. This is also shocking to Western Europeans, at least. So there is this sort of basic concern about security. Again, it's a hard security agenda also, which we haven't seen for 25 years. It's not been very important. And there's also this, I would call almost yearning for security of national identity. Sometimes takes the form of nationalism, but at least it takes the form of multicultural reaction to multiculturalism and the multicultural paradigm. And then, of course, the economic jobs, welfare state, equality, and the mix of these. I think the agenda is mixed up together as anti-migration, anti-EU, open borders, and the economic issues. So clearly, there are major changes in European politics for the time being. Now let's look at the 3 criteria before we apply them to Europe. The common good. This is something that could be illustrated by the German terms for society, that you can have a thin society, just a sort of interactive society based on basically self-interest perhaps, and a community where you share much more, where you really have a Gemeinschaft. And the common good refers, of course, to something that is more than interest-based. It is not just my interest and yours, it is something we have in common. And the ancients wrote about this as being the highest state of political, political participation, or the polis is the highest state of community. And this is ontological, according to Aristotle, Thomas, and the tradition. The human person is created as a social creature, a social animal, with the ability of acting ethically, knowing what right action is. So this is not the self-interested individual that is sort of based on a contract will act together. Civic education is what is needed, the virtue of civics, the virtue of being a citizen, and citizenship develops fairly late. Historically, citizenship is a rare privilege for many centuries. Citizenship was based on birth, on privilege, on being rich, on being a male. So citizenship, as we think about it as a universal right for somebody over 18 or 17 or 21, is something that comes very late historically, much later than the separation of powers and constitution making. So we could say the constitution making is perhaps typical of the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. The working class is not enfranchised until much later, and women even later. So this is something one often thinks about as democracy as having developed first, but that's not the case. So citizenship in our form, universal citizenship, however, confined to one's state, to one's what has then become the nation state, this is the political form that is given, with which we work for the time being. And the other qualification or requirement for participation is what I term the rule of law, the separation of powers. And here we can find rule by law that some few, at the time, powerful men would decide on laws. But they would decide on laws in an orderly manner, in a political manner, at the thing, at the parliamentary site, already around year 1000. This is in Iceland, this is in the Nordics, that we can trace the laws mattered, and one follow the laws. Punishment by judges was accepted, and the sagas are really full of this. And of course, here in this country and this city, there was rule by law and acceptance of the law's importance much, much earlier. So what we get later, the checks and balance, is of course related to the social contract and the empowerment of the Bürger. And there one gets recall mechanisms and representative democracy gradually. If we accept that accountability becomes a key, I should say democratic criterion, not participatory, but rather democratic criterion, we see that political participation makes sense when it is also based on, when it also allows for recall and checks and balance. Subsidiarity then is something that relates to participation as ensuring or being possible or being able to ensure closeness to decisions taken. Carol Pateman writes about this in 1976, I think her book was. Participatory democracy is being able to participate in decisions that affect yourself. And that is partially a subsidiarity concern, but subsidiarity has also to do with the levels of government, the determination of where decisions are to be taken. Typically, the term is Kompetenzkatalog in German, which is the idea, the German idea, the federal idea that one should be able to separate decision-making policy areas should be ascribed to these 4 levels of federal government: local, regional, national, and supranational, EU level in this case. And subsidiarity is also something important for the limitation, the limitation of politics. It's, as one could call, a bottom-up ideology. One starts with a human person and it's his or her natural associations, family, churches, NGOs, whatever, and politics enters at the top in a way. The role of the state is there for the truly common interests of the polis. And subsidiarity is an absolutely key principle in determining meaningfully what belongs to politics and what does not belong to politics. And as you know, very much of the battle around politics is politicization of areas that maybe shouldn't be. Now, if we look at European politics and try to apply these criteria to the current European political situation. Of course, this will be a tentative application, but if we look at, let's say, the common good, how much of a quality is there in participation in Europe today? Do we see the serving of the common good, the development of the common good? I would say that populist politics remains and is by definition opportunistic, superficial. So the weakening of the traditional party structure based on ideology is a major problem. If parties are not based on ideology, voters have no guarantee of representation of their choice of political principles. The very notion of representation is jeopardized, and elected politicians then are unaccountable. Populist politics represent an extreme weakening of the link between voter and elected. So the political candidate says whatever brings him or her votes, but is unable to deliver. Trump is an excellent example of how he promised a number of things that everybody could basically, or most people would see would be impossible to deliver on, and now a New York Times had traced all the regressions from these promises. So he says one thing and it doesn't happen. Populism is also a way of portraying of agenda setting that is quite pernicious because it is Manichaean, it is conflictual, it does not seek the common good, the common, it seeks opposition, it seeks division by exaggerating and simplifying. And populist parties are the ones that mobilize on the anti-immigrant, anti-EU, anti-globalization agenda. So this is the political space for populist parties is very big because the mainstream parties have abandoned this agenda, have not engaged on it. Mass migration, Paul Collier's work on the importance of this as a megatrend. Mass migration clearly has to be addressed by European mainstream parties, by governments. It's a security issue, it is an economic issue, it is something that has the potential of destabilizing European states. The inequality that we've heard so much about in this conference, clearly the economic inequality has to be addressed by mainstream parties. And this is not really happening. So we see that the political vacuum that is opened up to populist parties allows them to define the agenda, to frame the issues. So we have this problem of the common good is not served by this political situation at all. And participation then becomes the granting of power to representatives who do not represent. They are simply, it's like a lottery, you throw your vote for somebody, you have no idea what you get out of it. And this also goes for mainstream politicians that, in a way, leave ideology and parties behind, like Macron. A vote for Macron, what is that a vote for? Do you have a guarantee of any ideological basics that he will deliver on? So the case for civic education must be made. The purpose of politics, the common good, this must be taught. Politics is something specific. It is not the pursuit of private interest. And here I think Western schools, European schools, do no longer teach any chronology, political history, political philosophy as one ought to teach them. So the curriculum, and I think this is something this academy could usefully deal with. Then we get to subsidiarity. How well is that instituted in a way in Europe today? As stated, citizenship is national. It's a given. It is inherited as such. The national as such is a contested concept today by group theory or multiculturalism or identity politics, whatever we call it. And the paradox is that citizenship and the fight for democratic citizenship is something that was developed in order to achieve one type of equality among many types of inequalities. So it is citizenship. By virtue of being a citizen, we are equal, and we are not equal in other respects. And this is now turned upside down by this ideology of multiculturalism, which is a group right ideology. We are different in every respect. We have nothing in common, and this difference must be recognized politically. The nation then, as a concept, tried to bring a common identity to the voters within a territory, to the citizens. The nation as such is, of course, never a static kind of identity, but the question is really whether it's possible to develop, in a way, enough commonality for citizenship to make sense, because it is, as I said, confined to the state. There must then be common, in a way, enough commonality among citizens to have the potential for creating the good society within these states and beyond it. But it is in the state that we have accountability, recall, and pay taxes, and sometimes get conscripted. So we have this question really of is the nation as a concept possible now and in the future? Because if not, it's going to be extremely conflictual in European states. Lastly, subsidiarity. What about supranationality? Participation is not optional, is not optimal if the political unit is too large. There is no accountability, no common public sphere, no common language, etc. So there is no European democracy possible. I wish it were, but I don't think there is. We have supranational government in Europe, particularly in some of the bodies of the EU. I would mention here European Parliament. On a federal logic, if the EU were a federation, this parliament would be the main one. The EU is a confederation, but the EP has 50% of the decision-making power under the Lisbon Treaty. And this is a parliament consisting of representatives chosen with low voter turnout, without sort of clear mandate. They are to act in the European interest. There is no, in a way, contact between voter and elected EP member of the EP. So one could make a case that this is a very undemocratic institution. Rule of law, which is somewhat related to subsidiarity, but also to the checks and balance problematique. Here there are discussions that I think are important, that are being, in a way, actualized by events again. The political aspects of supranational legal power. Court of Justice is the supranational legal court, or court in Europe. It has developed its own role in important judgments back in the 60s, Van Genden laws, these two famous cases where it establishes its supranational role. The real integration in Europe is really legal integration. And I come from a country that is a passive member of the EU. We've been so since 94, 95. And it has worked very well, but there is no democratic input. There's no participation at all in the system for this sort of colonial status Norway. And the EU, as long as it has functioned well, as long as there's an output legitimacy, one has not raised the question of participation, democratic legitimacy. However, now this question is being raised, even if it is perhaps by populist parties. And likewise, as we talked about a bit with John's intervention, there is the Strasbourg Court, which has the dynamic method, which explicitly takes political development into account when interpreting human rights. And this is then the question of to what extent should a court that is so political remain a court at the international level without the check and balance, because there is no pure law and there's no pure legality and pure politics, but that is why we have the checks and balance system at a national level. So the debate about British citizens only being judged by British judges, American citizens only by American judges, which is the American position on the ICC. These debates are now about fundamentals regarding politics, law, and participation in decision-making. So in conclusion, I see there are all these zeros up here. I suppose that means time has run out. In conclusion, the current political situation in Europe is one where fundamental questions are raised about political power, who should govern, where should decisions be taken, why should supranational political institutions and courts be accepted, etc., etc. And debating these major issues is, of course, political participation par excellence. But political populist parties are the ones that set the agenda on these complex issues in a far too simplistic, polarizing manner. So it is now very important indeed that a proper and profound debate about the political architecture of Europe is possible, is made possible, and to this end, the contribution of the social teaching provides central concepts such as the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you.